Hello and welcome to this video on the Moon Phase from Patching Panda. Let's check out what's to come before we get into it. Now right up front, I would like to say thank you to Patching Panda for sponsoring this video. Now the Moon Phase is a unique stereo filter in that it implements a mid-side matrix to bring together two filters in stereo. We go in to the left-hand side, and that's one of these selected filter types. Into the right-hand side, that's the other of the selected filter types, say a low pass on one side and a band pass on the other. These come back into this mid-side matrix where they're brought together to create a stereo image, and we can control that stereo image, the level of the side bands, with the stereo image knob and external CV input as well. Inputs have level controls to drive into the filters, balance the stereo imaging, or just back them off to get a cleaner sound. We control the frequency of both filters on Moon Phase with the stereo frequency control, and there's an attenuator for the CV input over stereo frequency too. The button in the middle selects our two filters. It can be two of the same, two bands, highs or low passes, could be a notch and a band pass and a low pass, and the span control will actually separate out these frequencies on these filters. The Q control is the resonance, and working with a stereo image in the span, that can add some really lovely juicy vocal-like tones to your sounds. We've got CV over everything, stereo in and out, nice and controllable, nicely playable. There's lots of patches and ways to use this, so the timing index is on screen. That's all linked in the description, so do skip through the video as you see fit. And let's dive into the video. So let's start by checking out the sound of Moon Phase. That's just a flavour of this nice kind of juicy vocal sound that the Moon Phase has, and of course you'll be hearing how it sounds through the rest of the demo. So now we know how it sounds, let's get into some patches. So here's a nice shifting, modulating, stereo kind of bass synth riff. It's a single oscillator with saw wave into the left, square wave into the right, again from a single oscillator, modulation, output to data for that Lissajous curve, and that's what we're recording. Now removing the effects, we can add a bit more interest and kind of tonal shift by gating the mode and triggering through the different filter types. So here I'm using Moon Phase to turn my mono effect send that's fully wet into a stereo swirling tonal shifting sound. I'll let you listen for a moment. Now my dry sound is a slightly wonky FM sequence, nice plucky short, sound coming into this punch VCA. Now that goes into my mixer dry, which is what you're hearing. And then my fully wet chain is the crush delay, which is a nice noisy PT delay you can just see on the corner of the screen here, with a little bit of spring reverb coming into Moon Phase. I then have 4 free running LFOs, modulating the span, stereo image, stereo frequency, and the Q, the resonance. Bringing that dry sound back in. Nice lush effect sound. So here's a stereo drum mix through the Moon Phase. In time, we're actually switching these modes with a trigger. I'm triggering some sample and hold and modulating most of the parameters apart from the stereo image, which has an LFO on it. So I'll let this play. Every half a bar, every 2 beats, it's going to skip through the filter mode and change the modulation of everything on the filter. Now the LFO offers some nice tonal panning, and it's nice that some of these kind of mute out, some of them are bright, some of them are dull. So this patch started with me exploring kind of FM synthesis tones, wanting to use a simple triangle wave, which is what you can hear now. It's also the green trace on data there. I wanted to audio rate modulate it through this filter for some standard cleanish FM type tones. But I found a much more interesting stereo shifting, really lovely patch. And notice, you can hear the image change, but you can't hear the audio rate modulation or the span modulation. But as I bring the cutoff up, it all starts to emerge really beautifully. And we get this almost inversion of the envelope, and then pushing into these audio rate tones. I'm going to change the octave of this audio rate modulation into the frequency. And it's almost like the span modulation that's the envelope from punch. And the frequency cutoff there is what's fading in this audio rate modulation and envelope. It's really powerful, performative type control, simply moving that one dial. So this patch is all about that lovely swirl through the modes that's happening at the end of every bar. Now there's some drums, completely unrelated, so we'll mute those for now. Relatively simple envelope coming in. And that's from punch. We can hear the rhythm is some shuffled 16th notes with some ratchets. And then those ratchets are also on a separate gate channel, which I'm using to move through those modes. And as long as I have the right amount of them, I'm going to land back in the same place each time. But if I change the pattern slightly, I can rhythmically make these filter changes part of the groove and what's happening. It's just really interesting shifting through these modes, almost like it's a drum fill at the end of the bar. So here I'm looking at series processing through the Moon Phase, and because of that mid-side matrix that pulls these two filters back together, giving us our stereo image, some really interesting results. This is simply a saw wave into the first input, then the output of the left-hand side into the right-hand side, and then the right-hand output is what's on data there and what we're listening to. I'm just going to play around and see what kind of sounds we can get from this series processing. Some really lovely vocal formant-like tones. A little bit of self-oscillation. Of course, this will be different in the different filter types, different modes. Kind of going yoy yoy. Yoy yoy. So here's a patch modulated by 8 free-running LFOs. Using my drums, I have a super saw or super pulse oscillator where 2 LFOs modulate the detune and the blend of saw and square. That comes in stereo, with 4 more free-running LFOs modulating frequency, stereo image, frequency span and resonance, the Q setting. That then goes into pulse, where I have different gates and accents coming in, and I'm also modulating the decay time on each side with another 2 free-running LFOs. Cranking the decays, we can hear more of this tone come through. You'll notice that I'm clocking with 16th notes relative to my beat, clocking through these different filter types. So some nice swirling, changing stereo images, shifting oscillator tones, shifting filtering. So here's some rather distressed sounding, distorted filter pings. And distressed because of a very noisy delay and some distortion. Taking that out of my mixer, here's the dry output of the Moon Phase. And I'm using 4 stepped random voltages here, just to fly through lots of different sounds, because there's a large range to stereo pinged percussion sounds out of this thing. Bit of effects back in. So here we'll take a look at audio rate modulation. It's simply this top waveform into Moon Phase and then the left and right output being recorded. They're coming back into the scope on the yellow and the pink trace. And you can hear there my input sound is a mixture of these saw waves tuned rather low. Let's add some audio rate modulation first to the stereo frequency. Let's create a stereo image with that span and some stereo image control. We'll take the input sound up an octave. And then let's audio rate modulate the image. Different kind of sound. I'm not changing the rate of modulation here. Let's also try span. Slightly higher rate of modulation. So here we're going to look at audio rate switching of these filter modes. And we can push this even further if I take some other waveforms from my modulating oscillator. And that was a square in the mode. Let me put in, say, a sine and a triangle into frequency and image from the same oscillator. So now I have a much wider effect where a single oscillator square changes the mode and the sine and the triangle modulate the stereo image and the filter cutoff. So here's just blasting a lot of varied sounds at you very quickly with a patch that is modulating every parameter with stepped random and clocking my way through these modes. So it's a big rich input. It's a mix of those three sources. And then that comes into punch, where I'm modulating the decay times. So stereo decaying VCAs, stereo filtering over this rich input, lots of random mod. It makes some really cool stereo percussion. One nice thing we can get, because we're getting a sort of pattern, that's purely because we're clocking through these in a repetitive order. The triggering of the modes and the button press of the modes always works the same. We can actually halt that. We could of course unplug it, but just pressing the button, even while we're triggering it, will halt. So you kind of perform with the button when you're triggering the modes as well. So I was wondering if Moon Phase would acid. Will it acid? Will it do 303 style acid lines? And of course it'll do much more than that. I have this sound set against some drums. Let's lose those for now. And here's my signal path, which is a square wave into the first channel of punch, which is a VCA and envelope. Simple 16th note clock. And just changing the decay there. This then feeds the Moon Phase, and the stereo out is what's in my mixer to be recorded. Have the same triangle LFO, blue trace on data there, going into the span and stereo image. And I'm on a low pass and band pass mode there, mixing those two different filter types. And my main modulation here is this green trace, a more complex envelope from punch. It has a gate rhythm to trigger it, a slower or less frequent accent pattern to trigger it, so that's why we're getting different levels, 2 levels, more dynamic envelopes. And I'm also using a sequence to modulate the decay time. And it's definitely not 303-like, but it's not meant to be, but it certainly gives me a slightly acidic flavour, and that's what I wanted to try, something acid-like with more interesting stereo motion. So thanks for watching this video on the Moon Phase from Patching Panda. All the links are in the description. You can support my work, gaining exclusive content and joining the great community we've got over on patreon.com/DivKid. Hit like, subscribe, leave a comment. Do check out the other Patching Panda videos in the description. I'll see you next time. Cheers.